Yesterday, on the 4th of July, America's 250th birthday, a brand new Air Force One led a formation over Washington, D.C. that most people watching had no real context for. Fighter escorts overhead, a gleaming red, white, and blue jumbo jet out front, cameras rolling from every angle. And almost everything you've read or watched about it since has focused on the same two beats. Look how big it is. Look how fast it is. Nobody's actually asking the question that matters, which is, how did the United States end up flying its president around the world on an airplane that used to belong to the royal family of Qatar? And what does that decision actually tell you about the state of American industrial capacity right now? That's the story nobody's really telling properly. So let's actually tell it. And before we even get into the ownership question, it's worth pausing on just how much choreography went into yesterday's flyover itself, because a formation like that doesn't happen by accident. Getting a 250-foot aircraft low enough over the National Mall to make for a dramatic photo, timed precisely against a formation of escort fighters, requires weeks of coordination between the Presidential Airlift Group, Air Traffic Control, Secret Service airspace restrictions, and whichever fighter wing supplied the escort. None of that happens casually, and whatever you think about the politics of this particular aircraft, the actual flying involved in pulling off that formation safely over a major American city, on a day when the airspace over Washington is about as tightly controlled as it ever gets, is a genuinely difficult and well-executed piece of aviation. First, the basics, because there's a genuine amount of confusion out there about what's even flying and why. Right now, there are effectively 3 different Air Force Ones in play, and understanding the difference between them is the entire key to the story. There's the aircraft that's been flying presidents since 1990, a pair of aging 747-200 variants that have carried every commander-in-chief from George H.W. Bush onward. There's the aircraft that just carried the president for the first time 3 days ago on July 1st, a converted 747-8 that used to be a private jet for Qatari royalty. And then there are the 2 actual purpose-built replacement aircraft that Boeing has been under contract to deliver since 2018 and still hasn't. Here's the thing almost nobody explains clearly. None of these aircraft are called Air Force One until a sitting president is physically on board. Air Force One isn't a specific plane. It's a call sign, and it attaches itself to whatever aircraft the president happens to be flying on at that moment. So when you hear that the Qatari jet is now flying as Air Force One, what actually happened is simpler and stranger than it sounds. The president walked up a set of stairs, sat down, and the moment he did, an air traffic controller somewhere started referring to that specific tail number as Air Force One. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. That naming convention actually matters for understanding the rest of this story because it means every one of the aircraft in the current fleet, the 2 aging jets, the new bridge aircraft, and eventually the purpose-built replacements, all share the exact same call sign the instant a president boards any of them. The Air Force actually uses this to its advantage operationally. On this exact bridge aircraft's very first flight, one of the older 747-200s reportedly flew as a backup aircraft alongside it, using its own separate call sign rather than Air Force One, standard procedure for any special air missions flight that isn't currently carrying the president. That redundancy, having a second airworthy presidential capable aircraft trailing behind on a maiden flight, tells you something about just how cautious the Air Force is being with this specific transition, even while publicly projecting total confidence in the new jet's readiness. So let's rewind to how we got here, because the timeline is where this entire story actually lives, and skipping past any single part of it is exactly how you end up with the sanitized, flyover footage-only version of events that most people watching yesterday actually walked away with. On July 1st, the president walked up the stairs of this new aircraft at Joint Base Andrews and told reporters gathered on the tarmac that nobody's ever seen anything like it, calling it possibly the greatest commercial aircraft ever built. That flight carried him to Bismarck, North Dakota, for the dedication of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, marking the very first presidential flight on a new Air Force One in 35 years. 3 days later, on the 4th of July itself, that same aircraft led the flyover over the Capitol that so much of the coverage has fixated on, fighter escort included, timed perfectly to the country's 250th birthday. Impressive, genuinely impressive, from a pure engineering and logistics standpoint. But here's where the actual story starts, because the aircraft that just did that flyover isn't the aircraft the United States government actually ordered, paid for, and has been waiting on for 8 years. It's a stopgap. A bridge, literally, that's its official designation, the VC-25B bridge aircraft, and the story of why a bridge aircraft was ever necessary in the first place is the part almost nobody's willing to sit with, because it isn't flattering to anyone involved. It's worth noting, too, just how deliberately the timing of all of this was managed. Reporting from earlier this year indicated the target date for getting this aircraft into presidential service was set specifically at July 4th, America's 250th anniversary, months in advance, treated internally as a symbolic deadline worth accelerating the entire program to hit. That's a meaningful detail on its own. When a security-critical conversion project gets compressed to align with a politically resonant calendar date, rather than being allowed to run on the timeline the work itself actually requires, that's exactly the kind of pressure that tends to produce corners being cut, whether or not any corners actually were in this specific case. The aircraft arrived at its home base under cover of an unpublicized nighttime flight, specifically to avoid revealing its new paint scheme ahead of a planned unveiling ceremony, itself a small sign of just how tightly choreographed the entire public rollout of this aircraft was designed to be from the very beginning. In 2018, the Air Force signed a fixed-price contract with Boeing worth roughly $3.9 billion to build two brand-new purpose-built presidential aircraft, replacing the aging pair that have been flying since 1990. Fixed price is an important detail here. It means Boeing, not the taxpayer, absorbs any cost overrun beyond what was agreed. The original target for delivery was 2024. It is now 2026, and Boeing's own current projection has slipped to sometime around 2028. 4 years late and counting, with some estimates suggesting it could stretch even further depending on how the remaining work goes. It's worth understanding why a fixed price structure was chosen in the first place, because it wasn't an accident of contracting language. The idea behind a fixed price deal is straightforward. The government names a price, the contractor agrees to deliver at that price. And if costs balloon beyond the agreed figure for any reason, that's the contractor's problem to absorb, not the taxpayers. It's meant to protect public money from exactly the kind of runaway cost overrun that has plagued other defense programs for decades. On paper, that sounds like sound fiscal discipline. In practice, on a program this complex, it appears to have created a strange incentive structure of its own, where a contractor facing mounting losses on a program it's contractually obligated to finish anyway has limited financial upside in accelerating past a certain point, since every additional dollar spent beyond the agreed price comes straight out of its own bottom line rather than the government's. That dynamic doesn't excuse the falsified records or the missed deadlines, but it does help explain why a program structured specifically to protect taxpayers from cost overruns still somehow produced years of delay instead of the disciplined delivery it was designed to guarantee. What actually happened during those 8 years reads like a case study in exactly how a modern defense manufacturing giant can lose control of a program. Supply chains collapsed during the broader disruptions of the early 2020s. Workers with the security clearances required to touch a presidential aircraft turned out to be genuinely difficult to find in the numbers needed. Wiring designs had to be scrapped and rebuilt from scratch partway through production. A subcontractor was caught falsifying quality control records, a serious enough problem on its own that it alone could explain months of delay. And, in reporting that's been publicly documented, inspectors reportedly found empty alcohol containers inside the aircraft during production, the kind of detail that tells you less about any individual worker and more about a complete breakdown in oversight and program discipline somewhere up the chain. None of that is a small, forgivable hiccup. That's a company that had 8 years and nearly $4 billion to deliver 2 aircraft and still isn't finished. It's worth putting that timeline in perspective against other major aviation programs of similar complexity, because 8 years and counting for 2 aircraft conversions, working from an existing airframe rather than designing one from scratch, is an extraordinarily long runway by any historical standard. The entire original Air Force One replacement effort under prior administrations, converting the E-747-200 into a hardened presidential transport back in the late 1980s, took roughly half that time from contract award to delivery, using far less mature manufacturing technology and far less institutional experience building secure aircraft than Boeing supposedly has today. That comparison alone should tell you this delay isn't simply the natural difficulty of the work. It's a program that lost its internal discipline somewhere along the way and never fully recovered it. And in the middle of all that delay, in January of this year, one of the 2 existing 747-200 Air Force Ones suffered an electrical fault serious enough to force a diversion mid-flight, essentially the presidential equivalent of your car breaking down on the highway. That's the moment this entire situation stopped being an abstract scheduling problem and became an urgent operational one, because the aircraft the country was actually relying on to carry its head of state was demonstrably running out of runway, and the replacement was nowhere close to ready. So somebody had to solve that problem fast. And this is where the Qatari jet actually enters the story, and where the version of events you've probably heard gets a lot messier once you look closer. The aircraft that flew the flyover yesterday started life in 2012 as a private Boeing business jet, a customized 747-8 built for Qatar's royal family, and flown for over a decade by Qatar's government transport service. In 2285, the government of Qatar transferred that aircraft to the United States, described publicly as a gift valued at somewhere around $400 million. L3 Harris, a defense contractor based in Greenville, Texas, was brought in to convert it into something a sitting American president could actually fly on. That conversion work involved stripping the aircraft down, physically sweeping every section for surveillance devices that might have been left behind by its previous royal owners, rebuilding communications and security systems from the inside out, and repainting it in the red, white, and blue livery the public saw yesterday. All of that happened in roughly 10 months, arriving at Andrews in mid-June, completing its first presidential flight on July 1st. 10 months compared to 8 years and counting for Boeing's actual contracted aircraft. That contrast alone is a genuinely fair point, and it's the one most of the coverage has actually gotten right. But here's what almost none of that coverage has spent any real time on, and it's the part that should actually concern you far more than which contractor moves faster. This aircraft was, until very recently, the personal property of a foreign government's royal family. It spent over a decade in that role, flying between destinations most of us will never know, under a maintenance and security regime that answered to Doha, not Washington. However thorough L3 Harris's sweep for listening devices and vulnerabilities actually was, and however confident the Air Force sounds in its public statements about it, there is no way to fully, independently verify from the outside that a decade-old foreign luxury jet has been rendered completely clean, especially on a 10-month conversion timeline instead of the years typically devoted to hardening a purpose-built presidential aircraft from the ground up. The Air Force's own public language around this has been notably careful, describing the jet as safe, secure, and equipped with the technologies necessary for the presidential mission, while also acknowledging that some of the more specialized capabilities the actual replacement fleet will eventually carry simply aren't installed on this aircraft yet. Read between those two sentences, and you get the honest picture. This is good enough. It is not everything. Think through the actual physical process that 10-month conversion required, because it's a genuinely staggering amount of work to compress into that window. A commercial derivative luxury jet interior, custom built to the exact preferences of a foreign royal household, had to be stripped essentially to bare metal. Every inch of wiring, every panel, every piece of furnishing that had spent over a decade inside an aircraft controlled by another government's intelligence and security apparatus had to be inspected, tested, and in many cases entirely replaced, on the theory that a decade is more than enough time for a sophisticated actor to embed something you'd never find without taking the whole aircraft apart. That's not a paranoid assumption. That's standard practice for any foreign-sourced hardware entering a secure environment, and the fact that the Air Force undertook exactly that process is a point in its favor. But undertaking the process and being able to prove with total certainty to outside observers that the process caught absolutely everything are two very different things, and only one of them is actually verifiable from where the rest of us are sitting. And then there's the part of this story that barely made it into most of the coverage at all, the part that should be the actual headline. Ethics lawyers and members of Congress have pointed out that a sitting president personally accepting a several $100 million asset from a foreign government runs directly into the constitutional prohibition on federal officials accepting gifts, payments, or anything of value from foreign states without the explicit consent of Congress. That is not a minor procedural footnote. That's a constitutional question sitting quietly underneath what everyone else has been covering as a simple story about a shiny new plane. Add to that the reporting that the roughly $1 billion it apparently cost to convert this aircraft into a flyable presidential transport was partly drawn from funding originally allocated to the Sentinel nuclear missile modernization program, one of the country's most critical strategic weapons initiatives, specifically to hit the symbolic July 4th deadline. And you start to see why so much of this story got quietly smoothed over in favor of footage of a big plane doing a flyover with fighter jets next to it. And there's one more detail that deserves far more attention than it's gotten because it's genuinely unprecedented in the history of American presidential aircraft. Once this president leaves office, this specific aircraft, the one that just carried him and just led a national flyover, is expected to be transferred out of government service entirely and handed over to his own presidential library foundation. Think about what that actually means. A foreign government gifts an aircraft to the United States. The United States spends roughly $1 billion taxpayer dollars converting it into a secure presidential transport. And then, once its presidential service ends, it doesn't go to a museum run by the National Archives the way past Air Force Ones eventually have. It goes to a private foundation connected to the very individual who used it while in office. There is no direct precedent for that sequence anywhere in the history of American presidential airlift, and it deserves to be treated as the strange, singular arrangement that it is, not buried under drone footage of a flyover. Compare that to how this has actually worked in the past, because the contrast is instructive. Previous retired presidential aircraft, the Boeing 707 that carried presidents from Nixon through the younger Bush, for instance, were eventually disassembled, transported, and reassembled inside presidential libraries as museum exhibits, owned and administered by the National Archives on behalf of the public, not by any private foundation tied to the individual who flew on them. That's the model that's been used every single previous time an American presidential aircraft was retired from service. What's being described here, a foreign gifted jet transitioning directly into the private ownership of a foundation connected to a sitting president, skips that public stewardship step entirely. Supporters of the arrangement point to that same presidential library precedent as justification, arguing it's simply following the tradition of aircraft eventually becoming library exhibits. But there's a meaningful difference between the government retaining ownership while loaning an aircraft to a library for display, and the aircraft itself becoming outright private property of a foundation. That distinction is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost the moment the conversation shifts to how big the engines are. Now, let's actually talk about the aircraft itself, because underneath all of that, there is a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering here, and it's worth understanding on its own terms, too. The outgoing aircraft, the one that's been flying presidents since 1990, is based on a 747 variant that first took to the skies in the 1970s. Think of it as a heavily armored, extremely well-maintained vehicle built for a world that increasingly doesn't exist anymore, kept flying on parts that, in some cases, simply aren't manufactured anywhere on Earth any longer. It carries roughly 238 miles of shielded wiring, built specifically so that if a nuclear device detonates nearby, every system on that aircraft keeps functioning. That's not a luxury feature. That's the entire founding purpose of Air Force One as a concept, dating back to the Cold War logic that built it. If Washington disappears in a crisis, the president needs to still be airborne, connected, and in command. Not probably, not eventually, but under literally any conceivable condition. The new bridge aircraft is a significant technical step up from that. It's built on the 747-8, the final and largest variant of the 747 ever produced, with Boeing having shut down that entire production line back in 2023, meaning every 747-8 airframe still in existence anywhere is now effectively irreplaceable. This new jet is roughly 19 feet longer than the outgoing aircraft, with a wider wingspan, powered by 4 GE engines producing tens of thousands of pounds of thrust each, and carrying an unrefueled range of close to 9,000 miles, a meaningful jump over its predecessor. That range matters more than it sounds like it should, because it's the difference between a president being forced to land somewhere with limited support infrastructure during a crisis, and being able to continue directly to a secure destination without stopping at all. Consider what that range actually buys operationally. A president traveling to a security-sensitive region during a crisis, somewhere with limited Allied basing or contested airspace nearby, benefits enormously from an aircraft that simply doesn't need to touch down at an intermediate stop where security can't be fully guaranteed. Every unplanned landing during a high-stakes trip is a moment of exposure that the Secret Service and military planners spend enormous effort trying to eliminate from the itinerary entirely. An extra 1,000 miles of range isn't a marketing figure. It's one fewer opportunity for something to go wrong on the ground somewhere nobody fully controls. But here's the honest caveat that deserves to sit right next to all of that impressive spec talk. This bridge aircraft, capable as it clearly is, does not yet carry the full defensive suite that the eventual, purpose-built replacement aircraft are supposed to have once Boeing finally delivers them. Advanced infrared countermeasures, directed energy systems designed to defeat heat-seeking missiles, missile approach warning sensors distributed across the entire airframe, and complete electromagnetic pulse hardening across every single cable and system on board, engineered specifically to survive a nuclear detonation in the vicinity and keep the aircraft fully operational afterward. Those capabilities are reportedly still years away, tied to aircraft that are themselves still sitting in an assembly facility in San Antonio, being built from 747-8 airframes that were originally constructed for a Russian airline that went bankrupt before ever taking delivery of them. There's something almost fitting about that detail. The actual permanent replacement for America's presidential aircraft fleet is being assembled out of leftover jets built for a defunct foreign carrier, while the bridge aircraft currently doing the job was until last year a Qatari royal family's private plane. Neither part of that sentence describes a domestic manufacturing base operating anywhere near full strength. It's worth sitting with that Trans-Aero detail a little longer, because it's genuinely one of the stranger footnotes in this entire saga. Those particular airframes were originally ordered years ago by a now-defunct Russian carrier that collapsed into bankruptcy before ever taking possession of them, leaving Boeing with a pair of essentially orphaned, unsold 747-8 fuselages sitting in inventory with nowhere to go. Rather than let them go to waste, the Air Force effectively repurposed those abandoned commercial airframes into what will become the actual permanent Air Force One fleet. That's a genuinely resourceful piece of industrial improvisation on its own terms, using aircraft that would otherwise have been scrapped or sold off piecemeal. But it also means that every single aircraft involved in this entire presidential transport saga right now, the bridge jet from Qatar and the two so-called purpose-built replacements coming out of San Antonio, started life as something other than what it was originally intended to become. Nothing about the current American presidential airlift fleet was built from a clean sheet specifically for this mission. Every part of it is an adaptation of something that was originally meant for somebody else entirely. And that's really the deeper story sitting underneath all of this, the one that almost none of the coverage wants to actually engage with, honestly. The 747-8 production line closed in 2023. There will never be another new 747-8 airframe built anywhere on the planet, full stop. The Air Force has had to buy used, second-hand 747-8s from a European commercial airline just to train the flight crews who will eventually operate the real replacement aircraft, because there was no other way to build a qualified pipeline of pilots and maintainers for a jet family that Boeing itself no longer manufactures. The two purpose-built VC-25Bs currently being assembled in San Antonio will, in all likelihood, be the very last 747-8-based aircraft to ever enter American military service. There's already talk in aviation circles about whatever comes after them being based on an entirely different airframe altogether, whether that's a version of the 787 or some future aircraft that doesn't even exist as a concrete program yet. Sit with the strangeness of that fact for a second, because it rarely gets said out loud plainly. The country that once built the largest and most advanced commercial aircraft manufacturing base on Earth is now training the crews for its own most symbolically important airplane on second-hand jets bought from an airline overseas, because the manufacturing line for the aircraft type it chose no longer exists anywhere, including inside its own borders. That's not a failure of engineering talent. American aerospace engineers remain some of the best in the world, and the systems packed into these aircraft, the countermeasures, the hardened communications, the electromagnetic shielding, are genuinely cutting edge. It's a failure of program management and industrial scheduling, the unglamorous, bureaucratic side of aerospace that doesn't show up in flyover footage, but ends up shaping the entire story regardless. So when you step back and actually look at the entire picture, past the flyover footage and the fighter jet escorts and the impressive thrust figures, here's what this story genuinely tells you about American industrial and defense manufacturing capacity heading into the second half of this decade. The country's most symbolically important aircraft program, arguably one of the simplest presidential requirements you could imagine on paper, by two very large, very well-defended airplanes, ran 8 years over its original schedule and is still not finished. The temporary fix required accepting a nearly decade-old luxury jet from a foreign government, whose royal family flew it for years beforehand, converting it in a fraction of the time Boeing needed, spending close to $1 billion doing it, pulling some of that money from an active nuclear weapons modernization program to hit a politically symbolic date, and setting up a plan to hand that same aircraft over to a private foundation once its presidential service ends. And underneath all of that sits a live, unresolved constitutional question about whether any of this should have been allowed to happen at all under the country's own founding rules about foreign gifts to sitting officials. That is the actual story behind yesterday's flyover. Not just how impressive the engineering is, though it genuinely is impressive, but how much strain, improvisation, and quiet institutional compromise it took to get a functional presidential aircraft into the sky at all, 8 years after the country formally ordered one the conventional way and simply couldn't get it built on time. It's worth asking, too, what this specific episode signals about future defense procurement more broadly, because Air Force One is far from the only major program currently running years behind its original schedule. Fixed-price contracts of exactly this kind, meant to protect taxpayers from cost overruns by shifting that risk onto the contractor, have increasingly become a point of friction between the Pentagon and its major suppliers, with several large manufacturers reportedly reconsidering whether they want to bid on fixed-price defense work at all going forward, given how badly this particular structure seems to have strained the relationship between the Air Force and Boeing on this exact program. If the country's most visible, most symbolically important aircraft contract can run this far off schedule, the reasonable question isn't just what does that say about Boeing specifically, it's what does that say about the broader system of oversight and incentives governing how the United States builds its most sensitive military hardware in general. That's a far bigger and more uncomfortable question than whether one particular converted jet looks impressive doing a flyover. And it's exactly the kind of question that tends to get lost the moment cameras catch a shiny new aircraft banking gracefully over a national monument. None of this necessarily means the aircraft flying right now is unsafe, or that the president is at any elevated personal risk aboard it. The Air Force's public statements, careful as they are, do suggest a serious professional effort went into securing and hardening this jet within the time available. But safety and precedent are two entirely different questions, and it's the precedent that deserves far more scrutiny than it's gotten. A foreign monarchy's private jet, converted in 10 months, funded in part by diverting money from a nuclear missile program, destined to end its service life as a piece of private property, connected to the very president who flew on it. Whatever your view of how well that arrangement was executed technically, it is not a normal or previously established way for the United States to solve a presidential airlift shortfall, and treating it as just another impressive engineering achievement misses almost the entire point of why this story matters. The purpose-built replacement aircraft are still coming, assuming Boeing can finally get 2 more 747-8 based airframes across the finish line sometime around 2028. Itself a date that has already slipped once, and could easily slip again given the program's track record so far. Until then, the country's actual functioning Air Force One, the one that led yesterday's flyover over the National Mall on the 250th anniversary of American independence, is a converted royal jet from a foreign government, doing a job it was never originally built for, on a timeline nobody in this program's 8-year history has otherwise managed to meet. Whether that ends up being remembered as a clever, resourceful stopgap, or as a genuinely uncomfortable precedent for how presidential security and constitutional boundaries can quietly bend under enough scheduling pressure, is a question that's going to take a lot longer than 10 months to actually answer. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, one that extends well past this single aircraft. When a government program falls far enough behind schedule on something the public actually notices, the eventual fix tends to get judged almost entirely on whether it looks impressive in the moment, rather than on how it was actually achieved or what precedent it quietly sets for the next time a similar shortfall happens. A flyover is a single afternoon of dramatic footage. The precedent set by how that flyover's aircraft was acquired, funded, and will eventually be disposed of is something that outlasts any single administration, any single news cycle, and any single photograph of a gleaming jet banking gracefully over a national monument. That's the part of this story genuinely worth sitting with long after the footage stops circulating.